talking about waters of the United States and how that definition is being re-looked at by the federal government, particularly the Corps of Engineers and the US EPA. This issue has been battered around here for the last several years. It was a big redefinition in 2015, and it's recently been redefined, soon to be a new rule coming out this year regarding what waters of the United States mean. So I'm just going to spend a little time talking about that today. A little bit of history here. In 2017, the president signed an executive order on restoring the rule of law, federalism, and economic growth by reviewing the waters of the United States rule. That executive order directed the EPA and the Corps to review the 2015 rule and publish a proposed rule to rescind and revise the 2015 rule. So the EPA and Corps then went into a two-step rulemaking process to provide certainty or more certainty to the regulated public while they worked on a revision of the redefinition of WOTUS, Waters of the United States. First step in that process was to repeal the 2015 rule and recodify the prior regulations. So we went back to what we were doing before the 2015 rule, and they called that the 2019 rule. The second step was to revise the definition of WOTUS and replace the 2019 rule. And that final rule was signed on January 23rd, 2020. It's not in effect yet. It won't go into effect until 60 days after it's published in the Federal Register, which still has not happened. So we still don't have a new rule, what they're calling now the Navigable Waters Rule. That will be what we're going to be talking about or calling it after we get this done. But currently we're under what we're calling the 2019 rule, which is kind of pre-2015 stuff. We'll talk about what that is in a minute here. So the goals of the final rule, there were four primary rules. First was to operate within the scope of the federal government's authority to regulate navigable waters under the Clean Water Act and Constitution. I guess we're only three, not four. Restore and maintain the integrity of the nation's waters while preserving the traditional sovereignty of states and tribes over their land and water resources. And third, to increase the predictability and consistency through what they thought and hope will be a more clear definition of what waters of the U.S. are. So one of the main things there, the middle point there, is that they're basically telling states, if you want something more restrictive or more all-encompassing within your state as far as regulating waters within your state, you sort of do your own rules. The federal government's going to make this a smaller subset of waters that they're going to regulate federally, and states and tribes can do sort of what they want beyond that. Main categories, there's four under this new rule, this new proposed rule. The first category is the territorial seas and traditional navigable waters. That's really not different from what we had before. Tributaries of the above waters, which isn't different either. Lakes, ponds, impoundments of jurisdictional waters. There's some differences there we'll talk about. And adjacent wetlands to those TNWs. And that really isn't any different either. So not a lot of differences, but just trying to simplify the categories. Key changes. There's four categories now instead of 12 that we had before. I'm sorry, there was 12 excluded. There's 12 categories of excluded waters now. So they're actually defining what aren't waters of the United States, which is something that hasn't really been done very definitively before. We're combining the categories of traditional navigable waters and territorial seas, which I don't think really affects a lot of what we do. No standalone interstate waters category. So waters that used to cross state boundaries used to be a separate category. Now they need to meet one of the other definitions, one of the four categories to be a water of the United States. No case-specific nexus, no case-specific significant nexus analysis. In the 2015 rule, Justice Kennedy, in a Supreme Court case called Rapanos, came up with this idea of significant nexus, where waters that weren't hydrologically connected to a TNW could be waters of the United States if they had a biological, chemical, or physical effect on downstream traditional navigable waters, a significant impact on them. So an isolated wetland, for instance, that was close enough to a major river could be considered a water of the United States under that old rule, even if it didn't have a direct hydrologic connection to it. So that whole idea is out the window. It's not happening anymore. In the last category here, or the last key change is that there's a new category of lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. Tributaries, so what are those? Naturally occurring channels that contribute surface flow to a TNW in a typical year. We'll talk about typical year in a minute. Directed or through one of the other categories of water in the United States. So it can be itself a tributary to a TNW or go through one of the other types of waters that are regulated to be regulated itself. It has to be perennial or intermittent, not an ephemeral type system where it just flows after snow melt or a significant storm event. It needs to have at least some intermittent flow at other times of the year as well. That could get a little bit gray. Tributaries do not lose jurisdictional status if they contribute surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature. For instance, a ditch, which in itself is not a water of the United States. If a tributary flows through such a ditch and gets to another regulated water, that tributary doesn't lose its jurisdictional status just because it flows through a part of a water that's not a regulated water itself. The definition of tributary includes a ditch that relocates a tributary, is constructed in a tributary or constructed in an adjacent wetland as long as the ditch meets the flow conditions, perennial or intermittent. There's no case-specific significant nexus analysis needed anymore, as we talked about, and all ephemeral streams are non-jurisdictional. So some more definitions. Perennial, what does that mean? Surface water flowing continuously year-round. Intermittent means surface water flowing continuously during certain times of the year and more than in direct response to precipitation events. Ephemeral means surface water flowing or pooling only in direct correlation to precipitation events like snow or snowfall or snow melt event or rain event. Lakes, ponds, impoundments of jurisdictional waters. This is another category of the four we talked about. What this means is standing bodies of open water that contribute surface flow to a TNW in a typical year, either directly or through another category of water of the United States. Lake, pond, or impoundment does not lose jurisdiction by connecting to a TNW through a non-jurisdictional water feature. We just talked about that. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments can also be jurisdictional if they get flooded by a WOTUS in a typical year. So that's, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but that can go both ways. The lake, pond, or impoundment itself could flood and connect to a water of the United States, thereby making it jurisdictional, or that water of the United States could flood and connect a lake, pond, or impoundment through a flooding event in a typical year, and thereby making that lake, pond, or impoundment that might otherwise be isolated jurisdictional. Adjacent wetlands, another category here. Wetlands that abut, at least touch in one point, a TNW. Wetlands that are inundated by flooding from a TNW in a typical year, like we just talked about. So flooding events that connect wetlands that are otherwise isolated are jurisdictional if they flood in a typical year and connect. Wetlands that are physically separated from a TNW by a natural berm, bank, dune, or similar feature. Wetlands that are separated from a TNW only by an artificial structure, as long as that structure allows for a direct hydrologic surface connection in a typical year through a culvert or some other artificial feature. So if you have an artificial structure, like a dike or a barrier, a road, for instance, separating a wetland from a TNW, you have to have a culvert or something there connecting that wetland on the other side of the road to the TNW for it to be jurisdictional. Wetlands are adjacent when a road or similar artificial structure divides the wetland as long as the structure allows for a direct hydrologic surface connection in a typical year. We just discussed that. And there's no significant nexus test required anymore. Ditches, they are not an independent category of waters of the United States. They must meet one of the definitions of jurisdictional waters. Ditches constructed in upland and ditches with ephemeral flow are not jurisdictional. This is significant for us on railroad and highway projects. What's typical year? It means when precipitation and other climatic variables are within the normal periodic range, seasonally or annually, for the geographic area of the applicable aquatic resource based on a rolling 30-year period. So to determine your site, whether you're in a typical year or not, you're looking at a 30-year record, is what that basically says. When determining whether climatic conditions are typical for a particular place and time, the period of time examined may be a year or shorter or longer, depending on factors relevant to the water resource of interest. So when you're looking at your site on a particular time frame, I guess, or when you did your field work, for instance, you're looking at it in terms of a maybe 3 to 1 year period of time to see, am I in a typical situation or not typical situation based on that 30-year record that is in that paragraph above. This is the 12 categories, I think there's 12 there, of waters that are excluded from the WOTUS definition. So these are not waters of the United States. First category is waters not listed as water of the United States. Groundwater is excluded. Ephemeral features, as we discussed, is excluded. Diffuse stormwater runoff, just sort of sheet flow type stuff. Ditches that are not themselves waters of the United States. Prior converted cropland, that's kind of a big one. Artificially irrigated areas, artificial lakes and ponds. Water-filled depressions that are incidental to mining or construction activity. Stormwater control features, groundwater recharge, water reuse, and water recycling structures. And lastly, waste treatment systems. So what's next in this process of developing the new definition? The rule will be published in the Federal Register. That should have happened by now. I have a feeling it's been delayed because of the COVID-19 situation and more attention being paid to that, and some of these things are being delayed. Once it is published, it'll become effective. The rule will be effective 60 days after it's published in the Federal Register. And after that, who knows? It's obviously with something like this, anytime you're talking about definitions of waters and wetlands and how we're defining them and methodologies we're using to determine what they are, it's always a political football, and it'll be, I'm sure there's lawsuits ready and waiting as soon as it becomes published in the Federal Register. So we might, the 2015 rule, for instance, lasted, I think it was about 8 months or so before it was challenged in a federal circuit court and ended up being stayed because that court determined there was just too much controversy related to it. And so we didn't have a lengthy period of time under the 2015 rule after it was published. It might be the same this time, I don't know, we'll have to see. So this is just a graphic showing some situations that show where wetlands or waters would be regulated or not under this new definition. So starting at the very bottom of the graphic, you have groundwater at the very bottom there that's excluded, as we talked about. The main stream there, that traditional navigable water where you've got interstate commerce taking place there, that's obviously regulated. The next main stem from that is that perennial tributary that kind of goes north up the graphic there. That one is clearly also regulated. And then really what you have are these things that are connected to those systems, primarily, that are regulated. At the lower right-hand corner, we've got adjacent wetlands that are directly adjacent to that main traditional navigable water. We have that perennial tributary just to its left, and we have intermittent tributaries connected to the perennial tributary. Those are all connections that are considered waters of the United States under the new definition. Moving up the main stem of that perennial tributary, we've got excluded prior converted cropland. So that prior converted cropland would have been a wetland that was drained prior to 1985 and was considered prior converted by the NRCS. That would be excluded from this new definition. And also that ditch that runs through that prior converted cropland, since it was not, it was an artificial ditch apparently, and it's only connecting other non-regulated waters, wetland in that case. Further up on the left-hand side of that perennial tributary, we have an impoundment. That impoundment, what it's showing there is that it's connected, at least in a typical year to the perennial tributary, and so it's regulated. Further up on that same side, we have a jurisdictional ditch. That may be a ditch that was maybe probably a natural stream that was ditched, maybe channelized at some point, but it was a naturally occurring stream, and so it remains jurisdictional since it's not ephemeral. Further up on that same side of the perennial tributary, we have a intermittent tributary, so it's not ephemeral tributary. It's connecting itself directly to that perennial stream, and so it's regulated. And then to the left of that, we have adjacent wetlands and lakes and ponds, all of which are connected at least by flooding events in a typical year, or they may have a constant hydrologic connection to that whole system, which would make them jurisdictional. On the right-hand side of the perennial tributary, we have excluded ephemeral streams. So we have those streams that sort of flash, I guess, under a storm event or a snow melt or snowfall event that don't otherwise flow. So they are excluded. And then further to the right, on the upper right-hand corner of the figure, we have excluded ponds and excluded wetlands. These things do not connect to anything, even in a typical year, by flooding or other direct connections to something that's regulated. That is my show. I'm glad you were able to listen. If you have any questions about what this all means and how it relates to your project, I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone about that.